Some stories get taught, this one got hidden. Subscribe and let's dig it back up. The boat sat in the ground at Orkney for over 1,000 years before anyone thought to check what was actually inside it. Weapons first. A sword, corroded but recognizable, laid along the body the way it would have been laid in life. A shield boss. Ceremonial grave goods arranged with the same care archaeologists had seen 100 times before. On 100 other coastlines. The unmistakable signature of a Viking burial. Everyone who excavated that site in the 20th century wrote the same word in their notes without hesitating. Scandinavian. Then the lab results came back. No detectable Scandinavian ancestry, not a trace of it. The man in that boat, buried with every marker of a Norse warrior's send-off, carried DNA that traced almost entirely to the local population of the British Isles. The grave goods say Viking. The DNA says otherwise. Both cannot be telling the same story, and yet there they are, layered on top of each other in the same 6 feet of ground, refusing to agree. Same sword, same ritual, different blood entirely. So who, genetically, were you actually burying? For most of the last 2 centuries, the answer seemed obvious. Vikings were Norse-speaking raiders, traders, and settlers who poured out of Denmark, Norway, and Sweden between the 8th and 11th centuries, riding longship technology across the North Atlantic and down the river systems into what's now Russia and Ukraine. They hit England, Ireland, France, the Baltic coast. They founded Dublin. They sailed as far as Newfoundland 500 years before Columbus. That much is not in dispute. The routes, the raids, the trade networks, all of it is well documented and largely uncontested. Except one number in the burial record never quite added up. At certain sites, archaeologists kept finding far more Viking grave goods than they found actual Scandinavian skeletons to go with them, a ratio that should have been close to even, and wasn't, not even close. For a long time, that discrepancy didn't bother anyone very much, because the field had built itself on a founding assumption, that material culture was a reliable stand-in for ancestry. A sword in a grave meant a Norse hand once held it. A particular style of oval brooch meant a Scandinavian woman wore it. Ship burial meant Norse blood. You'd expect a discipline built on skeletons and artifacts to double-check that assumption early. It didn't. That assumption is exactly what a 442 genome study was built to test. And it didn't survive contact with the data. The study came from a team led by Ashat Margarian and Eski Willerslev, published in Nature in 2020. And it remains the largest ancient DNA project of its kind. 442 Viking-age genomes, pulled from sites scattered across Scandinavia, the British Isles, Russia, and Greenland. Think of it less as reading a single sentence of ancestry and more as reading a genome the way you'd read layered sediment. Each stratum a different wave of ancestors, compressed and mixed over centuries. That's essentially what admixture analysis does. It separates the layers back out. And what the layers showed was that Scandinavia's population was already absorbing gene flow from southern Europe and Asia well before the Viking Age even began. The Scandinavian genetic profile people assumed the Vikings carried into battle wasn't ancient and fixed. It was already a moving target before the first raid on Lindisfarne. Here is where it gets complicated. Individuals buried with full Viking weaponry in Scotland and Ireland, the same ceremonial rite, the same grave good assemblage archaeologists had trained themselves to recognize on site, were found to carry majority local British or Irish ancestry. Not Scandinavian, not close to it. If the sword doesn't match the skeleton, which one is the lie, the grave or the label we gave it? It recontextualizes everything from a few minutes ago. Material culture was never the clean proxy for ancestry that 2 centuries of scholarship had assumed it was. A Viking burial, it turns out, may have marked identity, allegiance, or status. Who you fought beside, who you swore loyalty to, far more reliably than it marked whose blood ran in your veins. And that same Orkney boat burial, the one this all started with, isn't an isolated case. Researchers examining a well-known Orkney boat grave, long assumed to be the resting place of Norse settlers on the strength of its grave goods alone, found that the 2 men inside it showed no significant Scandinavian ancestry component at all. Genetically, they were local Orcadians, islanders. People whose ancestors had likely been living on that coastline for generations before any longship ever beached there. Local men. Viking funeral. Nobody's ancestry matched the myth. It gets stranger the deeper into Scandinavia itself you look. You'd expect the homeland, at least, to hold together as one clean, coherent population. It doesn't. Genetic diversity at Viking Age sites inside Scandinavia varied wildly by region. Coastal trade hubs, the places where ships came and went constantly, showed markedly more outside ancestry, pulled in from the British Isles and from southern and eastern Europe, than inland farming communities barely 100 miles away showed at the very same moment in time. Viking Age Scandinavia wasn't one population pretending to be many. It may have been many populations pretending to be one. Researchers are careful to frame this as probability, not certainty. Ancient DNA samples are finite. Burial preservation is uneven, and no single skeleton can carry the full weight of a continent's history on its own. But taken together, the pattern holds across hundreds of individuals, and it points somewhere specific. Eski Willerslev's own team, the same group behind the 2020 dataset, has argued that Viking functioned primarily as a cultural and occupational identity, a shared way of life built around raiding, trading, and seafaring that people of strikingly different ancestries could step into, rather than a fixed ethnic bloodline passed strictly down the generations. In the same dataset, roughly two-thirds of the individuals buried under full Viking rite in the British Isles and parts of the Baltic carried non-Scandinavian majority ancestry. Two-thirds. Not a handful of outliers, a majority. The logic underneath that theory is straightforward enough. Longship crews recruited locally as settlement stretched across generations. Intermarriage happened fast. Assimilation happened faster, especially in places like Dublin, York, and the patchwork territory the Anglo-Saxons came to call the Danelaw, where within 2 or 3 generations a household could be fully Viking in custom, language, and burial rite, while carrying almost no Scandinavian blood at all. It's a clean explanation. It accounts for the Orkney boat burial. It accounts for the mismatched swords and skeletons in Scotland and Ireland. But it runs into a problem the moment you turn back towards Scandinavia itself. Because if identity alone explained the pattern, you'd expect it to look roughly the same everywhere it shows up, diluted evenly by contact and time. It doesn't. Interior Norway and parts of inland Sweden show tight genetic homogeneity at Viking Age sites, almost no outside ancestry at all. At the exact same moment coastal hubs a few hundred miles away were absorbing outside blood at a striking rate. A shared culture, adopted freely across a continent, should blur those regional lines. Instead, the lines stayed sharp in some places and dissolved completely in others. If identity alone explained it, the pattern should look the same everywhere it shows up. It doesn't. And that gap points to something structural, not just cultural. That structural gap is exactly where a second, messier explanation starts. The same 2020 dataset that mapped the Viking Age also reached backward past it, and what it found sitting underneath Scandinavia's genetic floor was not the clean, ancient bedrock anyone expected. Centuries before a single longship was built, Scandinavia had already absorbed ancestry from the Pontic steppe and from southern Europe, folded into the population through migrations that had nothing to do with raiding or trade. The Scandinavian genome the Viking Age supposedly exported outward wasn't ancient at all. It was a recent composite, a few centuries deep at most, still settling when the first raids began. And it wasn't only southern ancestry doing the folding. Researchers also picked up Uralic and Sami-associated ancestry in some Viking Age individuals from the far north. A genetic signature tied to older contact zones the pure Norse version of the story simply erases. Those weren't newcomers arriving after the Viking Age started. That ancestry had been there for generations, quietly contradicting a narrative that hadn't been written yet. Here's what that actually undercuts. It's not just that outsiders became Vikings once they left home, intermarried into a Dublin household, assimilated into life in the Danelaw, took up the sword and the right, as Theory 1 suggested. That story assumed a stable genetic core back in Scandinavia for people to assimilate away from. Insiders back home were already genetically plural before a single longship left port. There may never have been a stable core to begin with. Not abroad, not at home, not at any point the record can reach. You'd expect a discovery like that to at least come with a clean explanation for how it happened. It doesn't. The admixture data can show that the mixing occurred. It cannot cleanly say when specific communities absorbed which ancestry, or settle the much harder question of mechanism, whether it moved through trade partnerships, through conquest, or through the thrall systems well documented in later Viking-era sources, where captives were folded into households as property rather than as neighbors. The result isn't contested. The mechanism is, sharply. Picture, for a moment, a coastal Scandinavian household 2 or 3 generations before anyone in it had ever called themselves a Viking. Trade goods from the south already sit on the table. Amber traded one direction, glassware and silver moving the other. A grandmother's ancestry is already part Pontic, part something else entirely, and nobody in that house thinks of it as remarkable, because it isn't new. It's just what the family has always been. The Viking Age hadn't started yet. The mixing already had. Compare that household to a beach 400 miles south and a century and a half later, and the same pattern shows up in motion instead of at rest. Imagine standing on the shingle at Hedeby, one of the great Viking Age trade hubs, sometime around 950 AD. Tar and brine in the air, thick enough to taste. A longship crew waiting ashore, and the voices carrying across the beach aren't one language. Old Norse tangled with Slavic traders working the eastern routes, Frisian merchants haggling over cloth, and somewhere further off, fragments of Arabic, carried in on silver coins that had traveled from Abbasid mints through Rus River networks, to end up spent on a Danish beach. The crew that disembarks doesn't look like one people. They answer to one captain. That's the part the record can actually confirm. Hedeby and its counterpart Birka were documented, cosmopolitan trade hubs, and the genetics only sharpens what the archaeology had already hinted at for decades. Here's the number some researchers are more careful about saying out loud. At certain Viking Age trade hub cemeteries, more than half the individuals buried show ancestry patterns inconsistent with multiple generations of local descent. Not a minority of outliers, a majority. Which means those communities weren't slowly diversifying over time. They were in constant flux, never settling long enough into any one population to establish a fixed identity at all. The uncomfortable implication, raised carefully and rarely stated flatly, is this. Viking burial ritual may have functioned less like an ethnic marker and more like a status performance. Available to anyone with the right goods, the right alliances, or the right position inside a household, regardless of where they or their parents were actually born. One blunt, well-documented mechanism sits underneath that possibility. Later sagas record extensive slave-taking and thrall systems across the Viking world, and burial goods corroborate it. Forced relocation could fold outside ancestry into a Viking community within a single generation. No cultural continuity required, no gradual assimilation, no willing adoption of anything. Just captivity, and then, eventually, a grave dressed the same as everyone else's. This is the reading researchers hedge hardest on, and reasonably so. Sample sizes at individual sites are small enough that one unusual burial can skew a whole cemetery's statistics. Burial context, what someone was buried with, how they were positioned, doesn't preserve social status cleanly enough to confirm whether a person in a grave was free, captured, or something in between. It stays an open, unsettling possibility, not a conclusion. Here is where the whole shape of the mystery changes. Viking was never a genetic category to begin with, not because outsiders quietly infiltrated a pure genetic group over the centuries, layer by layer, the way the earlier theories still half assumed. It's stranger than that. The category Scandinavian ancestry, at the exact moment the Viking Age began, was already a recent, unstable mixture. Pontic steppe blood, Sami contact zones, southern trade routes, all folded together within living memory of the first raids. There was no fixed original sitting underneath it, waiting to be diluted. Sit with what that actually means for the mystery itself. The question this whole investigation opened with, were the Vikings really Scandinavian, carries a hidden assumption buried inside its own wording, that there was ever a single, stable Scandinavian genome to measure anyone against in the first place. The 2020 dataset suggests there wasn't, not after the raids began, not before them either. So when you picture a Viking, sword raised, longship behind him, every marker the sagas and the museums trained you to expect, what exactly is the blood in that picture supposed to be? Because the people burying their own dead in full Viking rite, inside Scandinavia itself, on Scandinavian soil, among people who had never left, were already a patchwork. Centuries deep, long before any longship pushed off from shore. Empty. That's the word for what's actually underneath the label once you take the assumption away. It doesn't just complicate one grave in Orkney, or one mismatched sword in Scotland. It dissolves the stability of the entire label the last half hour has been quietly testing. One geneticist working adjacent to this field has described opening an ancient sample expecting a single clean signal, and instead watching the software return 4 or 5 source populations tangled into one genome, and said, almost offhand, that it felt less like reading a family tree and more like reading a ransom note assembled from letters cut out of different newspapers. That image has stuck with more than one researcher in this space, because it captures something the clean version of the Viking story never could. Identity, at the genetic level, was never being written in one hand. Widen the lens far enough, and this stops being a Scandinavian problem at all. Roman identity rested on the same fragile assumption. So did Anglo-Saxon identity in early medieval Britain, Han identity across a expanding Chinese frontier, the Bantu-speaking populations that spread across sub-Saharan Africa over thousands of years, absorbing whoever and whatever they moved through. Every one of those labels assumed that culture and ancestry moved together, hand in hand, generation after generation. Ancient DNA keeps finding the same gap, over and over, in every population it's pointed at. A gap between the story a burial tells and the blood actually underneath it. Nobody is claiming the raids didn't happen, or that Scandinavia wasn't the center of the Viking world, or that the sagas are fiction. What's being claimed is smaller and stranger, that the sword in the ground and the DNA in the bone were never telling quite the same story, and maybe they never could have. An ancient genome doesn't read like a family tree with clean branches. It reads more like a palimpsest. A page scraped down and written over so many times that older words still bleed faintly through the newer ones. Never fully erased. Never fully legible either. Every Viking Age skeleton pulled from the ground is one more page like that, and every new one scraped back adds another layer instead of settling the question underneath it. Viking DNA wasn't even Scandinavian, and the closer anyone looks, the less certain it becomes that Scandinavian ever meant one thing at all.